The first cold snap of November came down the avenue like a tide pulling back, and at the end of the block, in the recessed doorway of a shuttered watch repair shop, a man sat folded against the dark, with his knees drawn up and his breath smoking in the dim streetlight. Wren Delaney saw him the way she saw the weather, the way she saw the cracked second step at the diner door, as a thing she had learned, to move around without thinking, except that she had never once moved around him. 11 weeks now, every single night she walked past him on her way home, and every single night she stopped. She stopped tonight because the temperature had dropped 4 degrees since her shift began. And because the man's hands were bare, she crossed the empty street with the leftover container warm against her ribs, the smell of barley and pepper steaming through the cardboard onto her cold fingers. The way you carry something you are afraid will go cold before it reaches the person who needs it. And she crouched a careful arm's length away. "Soup," she said. "Beef and barley. Pearl over-ordered, so it's that or the garbage, and I'd rather it was you." He did not lift his head right away. He never did. There was a long beard going grey at the edges, the cold cracking the dry skin of his lips, and a wool coat gone rough and stiff in the damp. Too good for the life it was living. And the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. That was the opposite of peace held very tightly. When he finally looked up, his eyes surprised her every time. They were not an old man's eyes. They were clear and dark and aware, and they looked at her the way a person looks at a thing they cannot afford to want. "You shouldn't," he said. His voice was low and rough and worn thin, scraping cold in the quiet, and there was something underneath the wear, some old precision in the way he set the words down. "Cross the street for me. It's not safe. It's an empty street at midnight, in front of a closed clock shop," she said, and set the container on the cold tile beside him, and lifted her father's watch on her wrist with 2 fingers the way she always did, before she made herself do a hard thing. If anyone's the danger here, it's the soup. Pearl's seasoning is a hostage situation that almost moved his mouth. Almost. She had learned to live on the almost. The wind came around the corner of the building then, mean and sudden, and it found the gap at the man's collar. And he flinched in a way he tried to hide, the small involuntary clench of a body that has been cold for a long time. Wren was already pulling off her jacket. It was a diner jacket, denim gone soft at the elbows, smelling of fryer oil and the lemon soap they used on the counters, and it was not nearly warm enough for either of them. And she put it over his shoulders anyway, the way she had put it over his shoulders a dozen nights this autumn. Because there was nothing else, and she could not walk home knowing she had not. He told her she'd be cold. She was 9 blocks from a radiator, she said, and tucked the denim closed at his throat, the way she used to tuck Theo in before he got too old to allow it. He wasn't. He held very still while she did it. Up close she could see the thing she had never let herself fully see, that he was not as old as the grey suggested, that the lines on his face were grief and weather and not nearly enough years, that there was a man somewhere under the wreck of him who had once been carefully, expensively kept. He pressed his bare knuckles to the center of his chest, the skin there rough and cold, a small habitual gesture, as though he were keeping something from getting out. She could hear the shallow catch of his breath, see the faint tremble in his hands. He was too proud to still. "Why do you stop?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. People who have stopped expecting answers forget how to shape the question marks. She thought of the parking lot. She thought of the thing the manager had told her afterward, about the footage, about the people who had stepped around the shape on the ground, and kept walking because it was easier to believe he was sleeping it off than to be the one who had to kneel. She thought of all of it in the half-second it takes to decide not to say any of it. "Because the soup's better hot," she said, and stood, and her wrist felt suddenly bare and light without her father's weight to anchor it. Except the watch was still there. It was the jacket that was gone. Eat, I mean it. I'll want the container back tomorrow. She walked the 9 blocks home with her arms crossed over the cold and her teeth set against it. And she did not look back, because if she looked back, she would go back. And if she went back, she would never get home. And Theo had a chemistry test in the morning, and she had promised to quiz him on the polyatomic ions. And the rent was due Friday, and her father's last debt had $311 left on it, and the world did not stop turning just because a man with clear eyes was sitting in a doorway with her jacket on his shoulders, learning the taste of barley. That was the thing she had stopped letting herself notice, around week 6, that she thought about him on the 9 blocks home. That she saved the soup on purpose now and lied to herself that Pearl overordered. That somewhere in the careful architecture of her not wanting, she had built a small room and put a stranger in it. She did not have a name for him. In her head, she had been calling him, with the easy unkindness of a person who means no harm, the old man. She would learn, soon enough, exactly how wrong she had been, and the learning would leave her standing on a sidewalk with the cold forgotten. But that was weeks away yet, on the far side of a December she could not see coming. And tonight there was only the cold, and the watch, and the long walk home, and the small stubborn fact of her, the fact that the footage in the parking lot would never show, that there are people in this world who stop. The lantern had been open since before Wren was born, a long, narrow box of a diner, wedged between a laundromat and the dark watch shop, with a neon sign that buzzed in the H and a counter worn pale and smooth where 10,000 elbows had rested, the warm air thick with the smell of coffee and grease, and the sharp, bright tang of lemon cleaner. Gus owned it and cooked in it and complained about it, and Pearl had worked the night shift for 31 years, and Wren had worked it for 4. Since the winter the bread route went, and the family's money went with it, because the tips were better at night. And because at night nobody looked at your face long enough to ask how you were really doing. "You gave him your jacket again," Pearl said, when Wren came in for her shift the next evening, not looking up from the ketchups she was marrying, pouring the dregs of one bottle into another, with the patience of a woman who has learned that the most of life is transferring small things from a container that is failing into one that is not. "I can tell because you walked in shivering and you've got that look." Wren asked what look. "Honey, the look of a girl who'd give away the radiator if she could figure out how to lift it." Pearl set down the bottles and squinted at her and asked if he'd talk to her. "A little," Wren said, tying her apron, fingers quick. He'd told her not to cross the street. Smart man. Pearl picked the bottles back up. "Most of them out there, the cold's got into their heads, and they're someplace else. That one's home, though, you can see it. He's just sitting in the rubble of something." She said it lightly, the way she said everything, but her eyes followed Wren across the diner. "You be careful with the ones who are home. Those are the ones can break your heart, on account of there's somebody in there to do the breaking." The television over the counter was tuned, as it always was at this hour, to the channel nobody chose and nobody changed, the murmuring loop of local news and weather, and the small disasters of a large city. Wren wasn't watching it. She was refilling the napkin dispensers and counting her float and listening to the rain that had started, fine and cold, the kind that would make the doorway at the end of the block a worse place to be by morning. So she missed the segment the first time. She caught the tail of it on the second loop, an hour later, while she was wiping down booth 4. A glass tower lit gold against the wet night, a logo she half knew. A woman in a charcoal suit with her papers squared in front of her, like a fortress wall, saying into a bank of microphones, "The company's direction has never been clearer. Mr. Vance has chosen to step back to attend to personal matters, and the board has full confidence in the path forward." Wren wiped the table and did not think a single thing about it, because the troubles of Glass Towers had nothing to do with the troubles of Booth 4, and she had her own tower of small things to keep from falling, and $311 was $311, whether or not Mr. Vance had stepped back to attend to his personal matters. Across the city, in a doorway 9 blocks east, the man she called the old man sat with a soup container empty beside him, and a soft denim jacket around his shoulders, and watched the same rain come down and pressed his knuckles to his chest, and did not turn on the phone in his pocket, the phone that had 240 unread messages, and a battery he kept charged at the library for reasons he refused to examine, because turning it on meant being Elias Vance again. And being Elias Vance again meant the boardroom and the lawyers and the woman with the squared papers and the long, slow machine that had waited until his mother was in the ground to come for what she had spent her life protecting. He had signed 3 documents in the worst week of his life that he should never have signed. He had been told it was procedural. He had been too hollowed out to read them. He understood now, in the cold clarity that grief eventually gives you in exchange for everything it takes, that the kindest interpretation was that he had been a fool, and the truer one was that he had been robbed by people who knew exactly how long a man stays stupid after he loses his mother. His mother had folded napkins in a diner once. Not this diner. A diner like it, 2 neighborhoods over, gone now, a phone store in its place. But he had walked the night he couldn't breathe anymore, walked away from the tower and the messages and the woman with the papers. And his feet had brought him to a long, narrow box with a buzzing neon sign, and he had sat down across the street from it, because the light coming out of it was the exact warm yellow of a thing he had lost, and he had not been able to make himself leave. He told himself he would leave in the morning. He had been telling himself that for 11 weeks he had not meant to let the waitress feed him. The first night he had refused, and she had set the container down anyway, and said, "Do what you want with it, but I'm not carrying it home," and walked off, and he had been too tired to win the argument by starving. The second night he had meant to give it back. By the second week he had stopped pretending. There was a thing she did that undid him a little more each time, a thing he had not seen another human being do in longer than he could remember. She did not want anything from him. She did not know who he was, which meant she could not want what everyone wanted. And so the small, warm gift of her soup, and her jacket, and her terrible jokes about the seasoning, was the only thing in his life he was certain had no invoice attached. He sat in the doorway and was no one, and being no one he was, for the first time in years, simply a man a stranger was kind to. He understood that this could not last. He did not yet understand how completely it would change him, or what it would cost her when the world found out that the no one in the doorway had a name, and the name was on the side of the building she could see from the diner window. Theo was asleep on the couch when Wren let herself in, a chemistry textbook tented over his chest, and the lamp still on, and she stood in the doorway of the small apartment and let the familiar wreck of it settle her. The dishes she'd left, the heating that worked when it felt like it, the photo of their father on the shelf, taken at a barbecue, laughing with a paper plate in his hand, alive in the way that photographs keep people maddeningly, uselessly alive. She turned off the lamp and lifted the book off her brother's chest and pulled the blanket up over him. And he stirred and said, not quite awake, "Did you eat?" And she said yes, even though she hadn't, because that was the other thing she had not let herself notice, that she had started skipping her own meal, so there'd be enough to bring across the street, and that this was either the most or the least sensible thing she had ever done, and she was too tired tonight to decide which. She lay awake a long time listening to the rain, and she thought about clear, dark eyes in an old man's face, and she pressed her own knuckles to her own chest, mimicking, without knowing it, the gesture of a man she would not be able to call a stranger for very much longer, and she fell asleep before she could catch herself wanting anything, which was the only way she ever let herself fall asleep at all. The rain became a habit, and so did he. December came in grey and serious, and the city put up its lights, and the doorway at the end of the block got a piece of cardboard. And then, one night, a proper sleeping bag that Wren did not ask about, and the man did not explain, and she chose to believe he'd found it, rather than that he'd had it all along, because believing he was as helpless as he looked was easier than the alternative, which was that a man with that voice and those eyes had chosen the doorway, and a person who chooses the doorway is carrying something you cannot fix with soup. "You're a clock," she told him one night, settling onto the cold step beside him with 2 coffees, because Gus had finally stopped pretending he didn't notice the soup and had started leaving, a second cup out, which was as close as Gus came to tenderness. "You know that? 11 weeks and I could set my watch by you. Same doorway, same spot, same face, like you're doing long division in your head." He agreed that he was predictable. Predictable's underrated. She handed him the coffee, and he took it with both hands, and she noticed his hands were cleaner than they used to be, the nails trimmed, and she filed it away with the sleeping bag in the drawer of things she chose not to ask about. My dad used to say the same thing came around the same time for a reason. The same bus, the same season, the same song on the radio. He said it meant the world was trying to keep a promise. The man was quiet. Then he asked what her father did. She felt the old door start to swing shut in her chest, the reflex, the change, the subject, and she heard herself, to her own surprise, hold it open a crack, drove a delivery route, bread mostly. 22 years, same route, before the company sold and the new owners decided a younger man would do it cheaper. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He took it fine on the outside. That was his whole thing, taking it fine on the outside. She stopped. The door swung the rest of the way shut, gently, of its own weight. Anyway, he believed in the same thing coming around, so, "You're a clock. It's a compliment." "My mother," the man said, and stopped and pressed his knuckles to his sternum, and Wren went very still, because in 11 weeks he had never offered a single true thing about himself unasked. My mother believed something like that. She used to say you could tell what a person was by who they were to the people who couldn't do anything for them. He looked at the lit window of the diner across the street, the warm yellow of it, the steam on the glass. She would have liked you. She would have said you were the kind of person the world keeps a promise to. Is she? Wren started and didn't finish because his face had already answered. The particular collapse of a recent grief, the wound still wet. 8 weeks before I sat down in this doorway, he said. I keep thinking I'll feel her less. It's the opposite. She gets bigger. He drank the coffee. I'm sorry. You came out here to be kind, and I'm handing you a... Don't. She put her hand near his, not on it, near it, on the cold tile between them. Don't apologize for being a person at me. It's the most interesting thing you've done all winter. And there it was, finally, fully. His mouth moved, the almost became an actual thing, a real and tired and astonishing smile, and Wren felt it land somewhere under her ribs with the unfair force of a thing you have waited 11 weeks to see. There it was, she said gently. She'd known all along he had one in him. It would be the last easy night. She did not know that. If she had known, she might have stayed longer, might have let her hand close the last inch, might have asked his name and changed the order of everything. Instead, she finished her coffee and took both cups and said the same thing she always said. Eat. I mean it. I'll want the container back," and walked her 9 blocks, and the next night the black car was there. She smelled it before she saw it. The way you smell money sometimes, the clean exhaust of an engine that has never once been neglected, and she came around the corner with the soup, warm against her ribs, and stopped. A car the length of a small boat, black as a closed eye, idled in front of the watch shop, and a man in a coat that cost more than Wren made in a season stood on the sidewalk with an umbrella he was not using, because it wasn't raining, holding it the way people hold an object that signals they are too important to be where they are. And the old man, her old man, the clock, the almost smile, was standing. He was on his feet for the first time she had ever seen, and he was taller than she'd understood, and the umbrella man was saying something to him in a low, urgent voice. And the words that reached her across the wet pavement were, "Board votes Thursday, and if you are not in that room, Crane has it, all of it. She has the foundation too. Do you understand what that means for?" The old man saw her. Over the umbrella man's shoulder, he saw her standing there with the container in her hands, and something terrible and tender crossed his face. Something that looked, she would realize much later, exactly like a man being caught. "Wren," he said. It was the first time he had ever used her name. She had told it to him in week 3, and he had kept it. All this time, like the soup containers, returned only when it mattered. The umbrella man, not even glancing at her, said they should go. The longer he stayed out here, the worse it got. The old man told him to give him a minute. They didn't have a minute, the man began, and the old man said it again, low and flat, that he should give him a minute. And there it was, the precision she had heard underneath the wear all along, except now there was nothing worn over it. Now it was just the voice itself, a voice that was used to rooms going quiet. And the umbrella man went quiet and stepped back, and Wren understood with a cold, slow horror that the man she had been feeding soup was not a man the world had forgotten. He was a man the world was looking for. "I have to explain something," he said, crossing to her, and she stepped back without deciding to. One step, the container held up between them like a small warm shield. "Who are you?" she said. His name was Elias, he said. He stopped. His hand came up toward his chest, the old gesture, and stopped too. Elias Vance. The name went into her the way cold water goes into you, all at once and everywhere. Vance. The gold tower, the woman with the squared papers. Mr. Vance has chosen to step back to attend to personal matters. She looked at the doorway, the cardboard, the sleeping bag she had decided to believe he'd found, the 11 weeks of soup, the jacket, her father's watch heavy on her wrist, and the whole careful structure of what she had thought was happening came down all at once with a sound like a held breath finally let go. "You have a building," she said. It was not what she meant to say. It was the only thing small enough to hold. "I can see your building from the window where I work." He started to say her name, all this time. She was not crying. She wanted that on the record, later when she replayed it. She did not cry. She just stood very still while the floor of the world rearranged itself. "I gave you my jacket. I skipped dinner so there'd be enough soup. I told you Pearl over-ordered. She never over-ordered. I made it for you." She heard her own voice from a distance, flat and careful, the voice she'd used in the manager's office 2 winters ago, when he told her about the footage, and you sat there and let me feel sorry for you. "No," he said, and the word came out cracked open. "No, that's not. I wasn't. Wren, I didn't let you do anything. You were the only thing in 11 weeks that was real. I couldn't tell you because the second I had a name I'd have to be him again. And I wasn't ready to be him again, and you were the only place I got to be no one, and being no one with you was the first time since she." He stopped. He pressed his knuckles to his sternum hard. "I should have told you. I know I should have told you. I'm telling you now." The umbrella man cleared his throat. "The board votes Thursday." The car idled, patient as money. "Go," Wren said. He said her name, and she rode over it. "You have a building, Mr. Vance. You have a board and a vote and a woman with very square papers. Go take care of your personal matters." She put the container into his hands, into his clean, cared-for, billionaire's hands, and the closing of his fingers around it was the most familiar thing in this entire unfamiliar night. And that, finally, that was the thing that made her have to leave before her face stopped obeying her. "Eat it or don't. I don't want the container back." She walked the 9 blocks home with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and this time she did look back, once, from the corner, and the black car was gone, and the doorway was empty, and the cardboard was just cardboard. And she stood there longer than the cold could explain, frozen on the sidewalk, learning the particular grief of a thing you didn't know you had until the precise moment you found out it had a price. She did not tell Pearl. She told Pearl everything, and she did not tell her this, which was how Pearl knew it was bad. For 4 days, Wren worked her shifts and quizzed Theo and paid the rent and did not walk past the doorway, taking the long way home down the avenue, and she got very good at not thinking about clear, dark eyes in a face that turned out to belong to a man whose name was on the side of a building, and she was almost convincing herself it had been a small thing, an 11-week kindness to a stranger, the kind of thing she'd done 100 times and would do 100 more, when the diner door opened on the 5th night and let in the cold and a man in a charcoal overcoat, and the whole room changed temperature. He was clean-shaven. That was the first thing, the thing that stopped her hands on the coffee pot. The beard was gone, and the grey at his temples turned out to be a narrow streak. Not age, but something a shock had left behind, and his jaw was a young man's jaw, and his eyes were the same. That was the cruelty of it. The eyes she'd been feeding soup to for 11 weeks looked out of a face she had to entirely relearn. The suit was the kind of dark that swallows light. The coat was the kind of wool that costs a season of rent. He stood just inside the door of the lantern, with snow melting on his shoulders, and every late-night regular in the place looked up, and Pearl set down her bottles, and Wren stood behind the counter with a pot in her hand, and understood that the man she'd called the old man, the man she'd thought she was carrying, had walked into her diner in a suit that cost more than her apartment, and that the truth of who he was had never once, not for a single one of those 11 weeks, been hers to keep. "You can't park a car like that out front," Pearl said into the silence, dry as toast. "Honey, it's lowering the property values." A laugh went around the room, small and grateful, and broke the spell, and the regulars went back to their pie, and Elias Vance crossed the worn linoleum to the counter, and stood across it from Wren the way he had stood across the cold tile from her 100 times, except that everything was different now, everything except his eyes. "I'm not here as him," he said quietly. "I know how it looks. I'm not. I came to give you the container back." He set it on the counter. The soup container, washed clean, and on top of it, folded small, the denim jacket, smelling faintly of fryer oil and lemon soap, and now underneath of him. "You said you didn't want it back," he said. "I'm giving it back anyway. I'll keep giving it back. That's the only thing I know how to say that's true. You gave me something for 11 weeks and never once asked who I was. Let me give something back and not ask you to forgive me for it." Wren looked at the jacket. She looked at the container. She looked at the man who was somehow both the wreck in the doorway and the name on the tower, and she felt the LIE she had lived by since the parking lot rise up in her like a tide. That her job was to carry, not to be carried, that the second she let herself be the one who received, instead of the one who gave, the floor would open. She had spent 2 winters being useful, so that she would never again be the one no one stopped for. And here was a man holding her own jacket out across a diner counter, asking, in the only language either of them seemed to have, to be allowed to stop for her. She asked whether he had gone to Thursday's vote, and he told her he had. When she pressed him for the result, something flickered behind his eyes, the long division she used to tease him about. And he said only that it was complicated, that it was not finished. Most things aren't. She took the jacket off the counter. She did not put it on. She held it, the soft, worn denim, the smell of him in it, and she made a decision she would spend the next several weeks, both regretting and being unable to regret. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," she said. "You look like a man who's missed about 11 weeks of real food. Pearl made too much soup." "I never make too much soup," Pearl said. "She over-ordered," Wren said, holding his eyes, and Elias Vance, billionaire, sat down at the counter of the Lantern Diner, and for the first time in 11 weeks, ate a bowl of beef and barley as exactly himself, and Wren stood across from him with a cloth in her hand and her father's watch on her wrist. And neither of them said the true thing, which was that the easy part was over, and the part that would test them both had only just begun. He came back. That was the thing she had not predicted, the thing that undid her careful plan to file him in the drawer of things that ended. He came back the next night, and the night after, always late, always in the booth at the end where the light was worst, always ordering the soup and a coffee, and leaving a tip that Wren made him take back twice, before she understood that making him take it back was its own kind of cruelty, the kind that says you are not allowed to give me anything. And she stopped, because she of all people knew what it was to be told your gifts weren't wanted. On the third night she slid the bills back across the table, only halfway this time, a negotiation, and told him he could not keep tipping her a week's rent. He answered that it was what the soup was worth. She reminded him it was $2 of soup. "It's not the soup I'm paying for." He said it plainly, no smoothness to it, and then looked faintly alarmed at himself, and Wren felt the corner of her own mouth go. The thing she'd taught him, given back to her now. "Careful, Mr. Vance," she said. "That almost had a feeling in it. I'm told I'm capable of one or two." He turned his coffee cup, a quarter turn on the table, a habit. She was starting to catalogue, the way she'd catalogued his clean hands and his sleeping bag, the small tells of a man learning to be seen. "May I ask you something? And you don't have to answer." She told him that was usually how questions worked. "Your father's route, the bread route. When the company sold it out from under him, he kept his eyes on the cup. Did anyone fight it? For him?" The question went somewhere deep and unguarded, and Wren sat down across from him without meaning to, in the booth on her own shift, which she never did. "No," she said. "There wasn't anyone to fight it. It's a route. You're a number on a route. They found a smaller number." She turned her father's watch. "Why?" "Because that's what's happening to me," Elias said. "And I keep thinking about a man I never met, who drove the same route for 22 years and took it fine on the outside. And I'm trying to decide whether I'm going to take it fine on the outside or whether I'm going to do the thing he didn't get the chance to do." She asked him which thing he meant. "Fight it." He looked up. "There's a woman, Vivian Crane. She's very good. Better than me at the parts of it that are only numbers. While my mother was failing, Crane had me sign 3 documents that moved a great deal of control to the board, and the board is hers. It was procedural, they said. I didn't read them. I couldn't read anything that winter." He said it without self-pity, a man reporting weather. Thursday's vote was supposed to finish it, make it permanent. I walked in for the first time in 3 months looking like myself, and I asked for 3 weeks to review the documents I signed, and Crane couldn't say no to that in front of the room without looking like exactly what she is. So I have 3 weeks. He turned the cup again. A little less than 3 now. The clock's already running. She asked him what then, and then, he said, He would find out if 11 weeks in a doorway had taught him anything. His mother had spent her whole life trying to. Wren should have stood up. Her break was over. The pie case needed restocking, and Table 6 wanted their check. Instead, she said, "What did she try to teach you?" And Elias Vance told her, in a diner at 1 in the morning, about a woman who had folded napkins in a place like this one before she married up, and was never, not for one day of the rest of her life, forgiven for where she'd come from. About a family that froze her out so thoroughly that her own son learned to be ashamed of the warm yellow light he'd been born under. About the way the boy he'd been had let it happen, had let his grandmother's verdict stand, had built a glass tower as far from the diner light as he could get, and only understood, too late, with his mother in the ground, that he had spent his whole life running from the one thing in it that had ever been real. "The measure of a man," he said, "is who he is to the people who can't do anything for him." She used to say it like a joke, and mean it like a commandment. He looked at Wren. "You'd never heard it. You just lived it." 11 weeks. I keep trying to figure out how a person gets to be the thing my mother spent 60 years preaching, and the answer is just, you stop. That's it. That's the whole secret. You see a person in a doorway and you stop. Wren's throat did something complicated. "I have to restock the pie," she said, which was the truest thing she knew how to say, and she stood, and she did not run, but it was close. Pearl caught her in the back, by the pie case, and looked at her with 31 years of night shifts in her eyes. "Honey," she said, "I've been watching you not fall for that man for 5 days now, and I want you to know it's the worst acting I've ever seen, and I once watched Gus pretend he liked my casserole." Wren said he was a billionaire. "I know what he is. I can read the side of a building." Pearl handed her a stack of plates. "Questions not what he is. Questions what he does. And what that man does every night is drive past 40 diners with better pie to sit in the worst booth in this one and watch you restock the pecan, like it's the evening news." She paused. "Just keep your eyes open, baby. There's a whole world that comes attached to a name like that. And worlds like that, they got opinions about girls like us. You give your heart to the man, fine, but the world's gonna want to give you its 2 cents, and its 2 cents come with a hook in it." The world's 2 cents arrived 4 days later in the form of a woman. She came in the daylight, which was wrong from the start, because nothing about Wren's life with Elias happened in daylight. Daylight was for Theo and chemistry, and the rent and the $311 that was now $240. The woman wore a coat the color of a storm cloud, and shoes that had never met a puddle, and she sat in the center booth and ordered tea she did not drink, and waited for Wren to come to her with the unhurried patience of a person who has never once in her life been the one who waits. "You're the waitress," the woman said. "Not unkindly. Worse than unkindly. Accurately, the way you'd identify a tool." Wren said she was a waitress, that they came in sets. "You're the one." The woman turned her teacup a precise quarter turn, so the handle aligned with the table's edge, and Wren's stomach dropped, because she had seen that gesture. She had catalogued its softer cousin across a diner table at 1 in the morning, and she understood whose hands had taught Elias to turn a cup. "My name is Vivian Crane. I believe you've been," the smallest pause, a scalpel selecting its angle, "feeding my CEO. Wren said he paid for his soup. I'm sure he does. Let's be practical." Crane folded her hands. "Elias Vance is a grieving man who has, in the depth of that grief, attached himself to a kindness. It's very human. It's also very temporary. In 13 days, the board will conclude a transition that has been underway for some time. And Mr. Vance will return to the life he is actually built for, and the doorway and the diner and the—" Her eyes moved over Wren, the apron, the watch. "The waitress will be a chapter he's embarrassed to have authored. I've seen it many times." The kindest thing for everyone is to let that chapter end now, before it costs anyone anything they can't afford. Wren said she didn't know what she could afford. I know precisely what you can afford. I know your rent, your brother's school fees, and the balance of the loan you've been paying down at $31 a month for 2 winters. Crane said it the way another person might comment on the weather, and the bottom dropped out of Wren's careful composure. Because the loan was her father's, the loan was the most private wound she had, and this woman had it in a folder. I'm not a cruel person, Miss Delaney. I'm a practical one. I'm prepared to retire that balance in full today as a gesture of goodwill in exchange for the simplest thing in the world. You stop opening the door when he comes. She slid a check across the table. Wren did not look at the number. She did not have to. She could feel its size in the air, the gravity of it, $311 of her father's debt and probably 10 times more. Freedom in a rectangle of paper, Theo's school fees and a winter without the math of which meal to skip. And Wren thought about the parking lot. She thought about the footage, the people who stepped around the shape on the ground, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's hand on her shoulder, that this was the same thing wearing a better coat. This was a person offering her money to walk past someone in the cold. This was the whole sickness of the world in a single quiet transaction. And the woman holding the pen genuinely did not know she was the disease. I lift the radiator, Wren said. I beg your pardon. It's a thing Pearl says about me, but I'd give away the radiator if I could figure out how to lift it. Wren picked up the check, and Crane's mouth shaped the very beginning of a victory, and Wren tore it in half, and then in half again, and set the pieces in the saucer of the tea the woman had not touched. Turns out I figured it out. You can't buy the door shut, Miss Crane. I've been opening it my whole life for free. Crane looked at the torn check for a long moment, and when she looked back up, the practicality had gone somewhere colder. You think this is a love story, she said. Let me tell you how it actually ends. Men like Elias do not marry the door they leaned on while they were weak. They recover, and they remember leaning, and they resent the witness. I am offering you the only happy ending available to you, one with money in it, and your dignity intact. Refuse it, and you'll get the other one. The one where the world finds out and decides what you are, and it will not consult you. The press will not be kind. His grandmother will be worse. And Elias, she stood, smoothing her storm-colored coat, Elias will let it happen, because that is what he does. He let it happen to his mother. He'll let it happen to you. Ask him sometime about his mother. Ask him who stayed silent. She set a card on the table, squared to the edge. When the chapter ends and you need the goodwill after all, call. The offer rarely lasts, but for you I'll make an exception. I do admire a person who can lift a radiator. It's a pity you'll have nowhere to put it down. She left. The little bell over the door rang behind her, cheerful and obscene, and Wren stood in the center of the diner with the torn check in the saucer, and her father's watch suddenly very heavy on her wrist, and across the room Pearl said very quietly, not dry at all now, "Honey, what did she want?" "To buy the door shut," Wren said, "and you?" I tore it up. Pearl came across the diner and put her arms around her, smelling of coffee and lemon soap and 31 years, and Wren stood in the hug she had not known she needed, and felt the first crack run through the wall she'd built in the parking lot, the wall that said she was the one who gave and never the one who received, and she did not cry, but it was very close, and Pearl held on anyway, because Pearl knew that close was its own kind of weather, and a person should not stand in it alone. That night Elias came at the usual hour and slid into the worst booth, and Wren brought the soup and did not sit down, and he looked up at her face and read it the way he had learned to read the temperature of a room, and set down his spoon. "She found you," he said. It was not a question. Vivian Crane drinks her tea with the handle squared to the table, Wren said. She turns the cup a quarter turn. You do that. Did she teach you, or did you teach her? He flinched. She was my mentor. Before, she taught me a great deal. I'm trying to unlearn most of it. He pressed his knuckles to his chest. What did she offer you? My father's debt. Plus interest, I'd guess. To stop opening the door. Wren watched his face. She also told me to ask you about your mother, about who stayed silent. The thing that crossed his face then was worse than the thing the night of the black car. That had been a man caught. This was a man flayed. He looked down at the soup and was quiet for so long that Wren almost relented, almost said you don't have to, the way she'd said it before, but she didn't. Because Pearl's voice was in her ear, the world's 2 cents come with a hook in it, and she needed to know the shape of the hook. My grandmother is Eleanor Vance, Elias said finally. She runs the family foundation. She decides who the Vances are. When my mother married my father, he was a cook. He cooked at the club where she was a waitress. That's the whole scandal, a waitress and a cook. My grandmother decided they were no longer the family. Not out loud. Eleanor never does anything out loud. She just stopped inviting. Stopped calling. Returned the Christmas cards. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, I'd been raised inside the family she'd kept, the glass one, and my mother was the warm light I visited on the weekends and was quietly taught to be a little ashamed of. His voice did not rise. That was the worst of it. I was 16 the last time my grandmother said my mother's name to me. She said, "Your mother made her choice, and you don't have to make the same one." And He stopped. The knuckles went to the sternum. I didn't say anything. I was 16, and I wanted the family that had the money and the name and the certainty, and I let the silence stand. And I kept letting it stand for 18 years, and my mother was gone. 8 weeks before I sat down in that doorway. Still not forgiven, by people who weren't worth one of her napkins. So, that's who stayed silent. Crane wasn't wrong. She's never wrong about the worst version of a thing. It's her gift. Wren sat down. Her shift be damned. She sat down across from him, and she did not reach for his hand. But she put her own on the table, between them, palm up, an offer, not a grab. You were 16, she said. I was 34 8 weeks ago, and I still hadn't fixed it. You were grieving. I was the head of a company with a legal department, and I couldn't make a phone call to my own grandmother to say you were wrong about her. He looked at Wren's open hand on the table and did not take it. And she understood that not taking, it was its own confession, the same disease as the tip he overpaid and the gifts he couldn't accept. A man who believed that everyone who got close to him would be punished for it, and that the kindest thing he could do was give them money and distance and let them go. Crane's going to do to you what Eleanor did to my mother, he said. She told you so. And the thing I have to tell you, the thing that's the truest and the worst, is that I don't know if I'm strong enough to stop her. I have 13 days to find out if I'm a different man than the boy who stayed silent. And I'm asking you to stand in the cold while I find out, and I don't have the right to ask you that. So I'm not asking. He pushed the soup an inch away. He was, she realized, about to do the noble, cowardly thing, the thing men like him did. I think you should take her money. There it is, Wren said softly. He tried to say her name. You think you're protecting me. You're not. You're doing the thing you did when you were 16. You're letting the silence stand, except this time you're calling it a kindness. She stood up, and her father's watch caught the bad booth light. I tore up the check this afternoon, Elias. Before I ever knew your mother's story, I didn't tear it up for you. I tore it up because I am not a person who walks past someone in the cold, and I am not going to start being that person to make your life simpler. She picked up the soup he'd pushed away and set it back in front of him, firmly the old gesture. Eat, I mean it. You have 13 days, Spend them finding out who you are. But don't you dare hand me to that woman and call it love. I've been handed off by experts. I know what it feels like, and it doesn't feel like this." She walked away to restock the pie, and behind her, in the worst booth in the diner, Elias Vance picked up his spoon. And his hand was not steady, and he ate the soup like a man taking communion, or a man taking medicine, or a man, perhaps, for the first time in his life, letting somebody stop for him and not paying them to leave. The next 11 days were the strangest, and the best Wren had ever lived, and she knew, even living them, that she was being given a glimpse of a country she might not get to keep, because something shifted after the night of the torn check. Some last guard came down, and Elias stopped coming as a man visiting a kindness, and started coming as a man courting a life. He came earlier, he stayed later. He learned the regulars' names, old Marcus who nursed 1 coffee till 3, the night nurses off their shift, the cab driver who came in to thaw. He learned to refill a coffee cup, badly, scalding his own thumb the first time and saying a word that made Pearl drop a plate, laughing. He brought Theo a chemistry tutor's worth of help one slow Tuesday, sketching orbital diagrams on diner napkins, until Theo said, "You're kind of good." At this for a rich guy, and Elias said, "It's the one thing about being a Vance I never resented. We were all force-fed chemistry. My grandfather built the company on a fertilizer patent." And Theo said, "Your family got rich on plant food, and you've been sleeping in a doorway. That's the saddest rich person story I've ever heard." And Elias laughed, an actual laugh, rusty and surprised. The first one Wren had ever heard, and she had to go into the back, so neither of them would see her face. That was the night of the inside joke. Theo, packing up his books, had looked at the soup Elias was eating and said, deadpan, "Let me guess." Pearl over-ordered. And Elias, without missing a beat, said, "She never over-orders," in Pearl's exact dry cadence, and Wren laughed so hard she had to sit down, and after that it became the thing they said, the password, the small private shorthand. She over-ordered. It meant I made this for you. It meant I'm glad you're here. It meant a dozen things neither of them was ready to say with their actual mouths. And it lived in the space between them and grew, the way a fire grows when you finally stop being afraid to feed it. On the 9th day, he made his own joke unprompted. They were closing up, just the two of them and Pearl counting the register. And Wren was wiping down the counter and complaining about the buzzing H in the neon sign, how it had buzzed her entire 4 years, how Gus refused to fix it on the grounds that it had character. And Elias, drying a coffee cup he had insisted on washing, said, "I could buy you the H." She asked what he could possibly mean. "The letter. I could have it fixed by Thursday. I have, it turns out, a great deal of money and absolutely nothing to spend it on that doesn't embarrass everyone." "Don't you dare fix the H?" He asked why not. "Because then I'd have nothing to complain about. And a girl needs a hobby." She flicked the rag at him. "Also because you can't fix a thing just because you can afford to. That's the whole problem with you people. You see a buzzing H and you think money. The rest of us hear a buzzing H and think that's the sound of the place that fed me." He went quiet, the cup still in his hands, and looked at her with an expression she was learning. The one that meant she'd said something he was going to carry. "The sound of the place that fed me?" he repeated. "I want that. I've never had a sound like that. I had a tower with very good acoustics and no sound in it at all." And then, lightly, the joke landing soft after the truth, "I'm still buying you the H eventually, for your retirement. Something to complain about into your old age." "Mr. Vance," Wren said, "was that a feeling and a joke in the same breath?" Pearl marked the calendar. "Marked it 3 jokes ago, honey," Pearl said from the register. "He's been funny since Tuesday, you're just slow." And then, dry, not looking up, the wry observation she'd land every shift like clockwork. "Some of us figured out he was worth keeping back when he scalded his thumb on the coffee. A man who will burn himself trying to learn your job is a man who's planning to stay. The rich ones who tip big and never lift a finger, those you let go. The ones who scald their thumbs, those you marry. She closed the register drawer. Just an observation. Don't mind me. I only been doing this 31 years. The 10th night it snowed, the real first snow, the kind that turns a hard city soft for a few hours, and Elias walked Wren home for the first time, the 9 blocks, and they didn't talk much, and at her door she stopped and turned, and the snow was in his hair, melting, and the streak of grey at his temple caught the light, and she thought about the doorway and the soup and the 11 weeks she'd called him the old man, and she said, "I used to think you were old. Did you know that? In my head you were the old man at the end of the block. I fed you soup for 11 weeks thinking you were 70. He said he had felt 70. She asked if he didn't anymore. No. He looked at her in the snow and his hand came up, and this time it did not stop at his sternum. It reached the rest of the way and touched her jaw, just barely, the way you touch something you've decided to stop being afraid of. I feel like a man who got given a second winter. I feel, he said, and his voice was very low, like the place that fed me. She should have kissed him. She wanted to, but she was thinking about Crane's 2 cents and the hook in it, and Thursday was 3 days away, and she had learned in the parking lot that the moment you let yourself have a thing was the moment the world took it, and so she turned her face just slightly and pressed her cheek into his cold palm instead, and held it there, and they stood in the snow at her door inhabiting, for 1 stolen minute, a life that had not been promised to either of them, and Wren let herself feel exactly how much she had to lose, which was the most dangerous thing she had done in 2 winters, and worth it, and the last fully happy moment she would have for a while. Because the next morning the world gave her its 2 cents, and there was, as promised, a hook in it. It was Theo who found it, scrolling at the breakfast table, who went very still and then said, "Wren," in a voice that made her put down the coffee pot. The headline was on a site that traded in exactly this, the kind of site that ran a city's appetites. Billionaire's doorway romance. Vance hires secret months with diner waitress as boardroom war looms, and below it a photograph taken from across the street with a long lens, grainy and intimate and obscene. Wren in the snow at her own door, her cheek pressed into Elias Vance's palm, her eyes closed, looking like exactly what Crane had promised the world would decide she was. A girl who found a wounded fortune in a doorway and was holding on with both hands. The story underneath was worse than the photograph. It had her father's debt in it. It had Theo's school fees. It had a quote from a source close to the company. Crane, of course. Crane's voice all over it, smooth and practical and devastating, describing a vulnerable executive in the throes of grief being managed by an opportunistic local woman with significant financial motive. It had the parking lot. Somehow it had the parking lot, her father, the footage, the worst and most private thing in the world, rendered as a sob story she'd allegedly been deploying to Fumoxshire sympathy. It had a second photograph, older, of a different woman entirely. Elias's mother, Lena, young, in an apron, smiling, with a caption that called her the waitress the Vance family famously never accepted, drawing the line so blunt and cruel that Wren understood the whole architecture of it at once. Crane wasn't just ending the chapter. She was using the departed. She was reaching into Elias's deepest wound, his mother, frozen out for being exactly what Wren was, and she was pressing on it in public, on purpose, to break him on the eve of the vote, because a broken man signs what you put in front of him. She had done it before. It had worked before. She was, as Elias had said, never wrong about the worst version of a thing. Wren's phone rang. Elias. She looked at it ringing on the table next to the photograph of her own closed eyes. and she did not answer it, and that was the moment the dark night began. She didn't answer because she didn't trust her own voice, and she didn't trust her own voice because the lie was screaming in her now, louder than it had screamed since the parking lot. And the lie said, "This is what happens when you let yourself be carried. This is what happens when you let go of the radiator. The floor opens. The world decides what you are, and it does not consult you. Crane told you. Pearl told you. Even Elias told you, take the money, and you were too proud. And now your father is a sob story on a website, and Theo's school fees are public. And the worst night of your life is content, and the man you let touch your face in the snow is a man whose own grandmother turned his mother away for being exactly, precisely you. You are not the heroine of this. You are the cautionary tale. You always were. You were a waitress with a folder Crane could open in an afternoon. The phone stopped ringing, started again. She turned it over so she couldn't see his name. "Ren," Theo said, scared now, 17 and out of his depth. "What do we do?" "We go to school," Ren said, in the parking lot voice, the flat, careful one. "You have a chemistry test." Theo started to say her name. "You have a chemistry test, Theo." She stood. She picked up the coffee pot, because her hands needed a thing to hold. "We don't fall apart over a website. Dad didn't fall apart when they sold his route. We take it fine on the outside. Get your coat." But her father had taken it fine on the outside, and then his heart had stopped in a parking lot 2 winters later, with the taking it fine still. Inside him, unspent, and some animal part of Ren knew that the flat, careful voice was not strength. It was the same poison her father had swallowed his whole life, and she could not stop using it, because it was the only armor she had ever been given. Elias came to the diner that night. Of course he came. He came in a fury she had never seen, the boardroom voice fully unsheathed, and he said her name, and crossed the room, and she stepped back behind the counter, and held up a hand, and he stopped. "I'm handling it," he said. "Ren, I swear to you I'm handling it. My lawyers are already the parking lot. Your father, that's actionable. That's a clear." "Don't," she said. "Don't put lawyers near my father. They had no right to. They had no right, but you put me in the place where they could." It came out before she could stop it, and it was unfair, and it was also true, and the truest things are usually both. I was invisible, Elias. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Being invisible was the one thing I had. Nobody looked at my face long enough to ask how I was doing. That was the gift of this place. That was why I worked nights. And you walked in here in a suit that costs more than my apartment, and you made me visible, and now my father is on a website, and Theo's fees are public, and a woman I've met once owns the worst day of my life because she opened a folder. She was shaking. She made herself stop. You did this. Not on purpose. But you did it. You're a man who's spent his whole life learning that everyone who gets close to you gets hurt, and you were right, Elias. You were right about yourself. I'm the proof. It landed exactly where she aimed it, which was the cruelest thing she had ever done. Because she aimed it at the lie he had told her about in the worst booth, the belief that everyone who loved him would be punished for it. And she watched it go in, and watched him believe it, because of course he believed it. He'd believed it since he was 16. She had just handed him the evidence. You're right, he said, quietly, the fury gone, replaced by something far worse, a kind of terrible agreement. You're right, I should never have. You were safe, and I... He pressed his knuckles to his sternum, and this time it looked like a man holding a wound closed. I'll fix it. I'll make the website take it down, I'll make Crane, and then I'll leave you alone. You're right. That's the only thing that... Maybe that's best, Ren said, and there it was, the thing she would replay for weeks. Both of them, in the worst booth, agreeing to the worst interpretation. Him, everyone who loves me is punished, so I'll go. Her, everyone I love I lose, so let me lose you now, on purpose. while I can still control the losing. Two people who had finally found the warm yellow light, blowing it out together, each one certain they were doing the other a kindness, each one wrong in exactly the shape the other could not see. "Maybe it is," he said. He left. The bell rang. Pearl, who had heard all of it from the kitchen, came out drying her hands, and for once she had nothing dry to say, nothing wry, no honey. She just looked at Wren for a long moment, and then she said, "Your daddy took it fine on the outside, too," and went back into the kitchen, and Wren stood alone in the diner with the buzzing H and the empty worst booth. And finally, 2 winters too late, in the place that had fed her, she put her face in her cold hands and cried, the tears hot and the salt sharp on her lips, her throat aching raw with everything she had held quiet for 2 winters. She cried for her father, who had taken it fine. She cried for the woman in the apron in the photograph, Lena, who had folded napkins and married a cook and was gone unforgiven. She cried for the girl in the snow, with her eyes closed, who had let herself want something and watched the world take it on schedule. And somewhere in the crying, around 2 in the morning alone, she heard her father's voice, not the flat one he used on the outside, but the real one, the one from the good days, the one that said the same thing, comes around the same time for a reason. And she thought, but only if you let it, only if you don't walk past it, only if you stop. She had spent 2 winters believing her job was to give and never receive. That being carried was the thing that opened the floor. But the floor had opened anyway. The floor opened whether you let yourself be loved or not, and if the floor was going to open regardless, then the only question left, the only thing that had ever been in her hands, was whether she went down it alone, in the flat, careful voice, taking it fine on the outside like her father, or whether she did the other thing, the braver thing, the thing she'd been doing for strangers her whole life and had never once let herself do for her own heart. She stopped. Even now, especially now, she decided to stop. She did not sleep. She made a pot of coffee at 3 in the morning, the bitter smell of it sharp in the cold, dark kitchen, and she sat at the breakfast table with the website still open on Theo's tablet, the screen too bright on her tired eyes. And she did the thing she was actually good at, the thing the parking lot had taught her, which was not giving up. She read. She read the whole vicious article again, not as a victim this time, but the way Elias read documents, the way she should have read it the first time. And on the 4th read, she saw it. Crane's quote about the vulnerable executive in the throes of grief being managed. The photograph of Lena with its surgical caption, the way the story moved, the timing 2 days before the vote. This wasn't gossip. This was a weapon, built and aimed, and a weapon has a maker, and a maker can be shown. Crane had spent the story painting Elias as a broken man who couldn't be trusted with his own company. She'd done it to win the vote. But in doing it, she'd written down, in public, with witnesses, exactly the thing the board most needed to never believe was a strategy, that the COO was deliberately exploiting the CEO's late mother to manufacture a narrative of incapacity. Crane had been so busy being never wrong about the worst version of Wren that she'd put the worst version of herself in print. Wren did not have lawyers. She's had something Crane had never bothered to fear, because women like Crane never feared it. She had been underestimated her whole life, which meant she had spent her whole life watching the people who underestimated her, learning them, cataloguing their tells, the way she'd catalogued the quarter turn of a teacup. And she had one thing Crane could not fold into a folder, one thing worth more than the torn check. One thing that could put the warm yellow light back into a man who'd decided he was a curse. She had the truth about who Elias Vance actually was. Not the broken executive. Not the doorway romance. The man who scolded his thumb, learning to refill a coffee cup. The man who could draw an orbital diagram on a napkin. The man whose mother had folded napkins, and whose whole tragedy was that he'd been taught to be ashamed of the light he was born under, and who had spent 11 weeks in a doorway learning, too late he thought, that the measure of a man is who he is to the people who can't do anything for him. The vote was in 2 days. She had 2 days to give a billionaire back the one thing money couldn't buy and a website couldn't take. She had to give Elias Vance back his mother. It started, of all places, with Eleanor. Wren had not planned it. She had planned to go to the diner, to find Pearl, to figure out how a person without lawyers fights a person with a folder. But she had stopped at the Lantern at dawn, before her shift, before the city was properly awake, to think, and to borrow Pearl's clearer head. And she had let herself in with her key and found, sitting at the counter in the grey first light, a woman she had never met and knew instantly. Eleanor Vance was 70-something, and straight-backed and dressed for a board meeting at 6 in the morning, and she was sitting alone at the worn counter of a diner. She had no earthly reason to be in, with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in front of her, and she was running her thumb over her wedding ring around and around, and she did not hear Wren come in. And Wren, frozen in the doorway, watched the matriarch of the Vance family reach out one ringed hand and lay it flat on the counter, on the pale worn wood, where 10,000 elbows had rested, where Lena had never worked but 1,000 women like Lena had, and bow her head, just slightly, the smallest collapse of a spine that had not bent in 50 years. There was a single flower on the counter beside the untouched coffee. A white one, the kind you leave. Wren understood, without a single word being exchanged, that she was seeing something she was not meant to see, that Eleanor Vance, who decided who the Vances were, who had frozen out her own daughter for marrying a cook, had read the same website Wren had read, had seen the photograph of Lena in the apron with its cruel caption, and had come at dawn alone to the nearest thing to the diner where her daughter had once worked, to sit at a counter like the one she'd refused to let her family come from, and to grieve 50 years too late in the only private place a woman that public could find. Wren stepped back, quietly. She let the door close without a sound, and she stood on the sidewalk in the cold and let the old woman have her dawn, because Wren of all people knew that some grief should not have a witness, and because she had just learned the most important thing she would learn in this entire war. Eleanor Vance was not a wall. She was a woman who had stayed silent and lost everything to it, exactly like her grandson, exactly like Wren's own father, and a woman like that was not Wren's enemy. A woman like that was the only ally who could actually win this. When she went back in 10 minutes later, loud this time, letting the bell ring, Eleanor had composed herself, the flower gone into her bag, the spine straight again, the verdict face back on. "You're the waitress," Eleanor said in a voice like a closing door. "I'm the waitress." Wren agreed and tied on her apron and poured herself a coffee and sat down 2 stools away, close enough to talk, far enough to leave the old woman her dignity. "And you're the grandmother. I know. I read the same website you did." She watched Eleanor's thumb go still on the ring. "I'm not going to ask you to like me. I'm going to ask you for help. Because there's a woman named Vivian Crane who just used your daughter. Lena used a photo of her in an apron to break your grandson before a vote, and she did it because she's counting on the Vance family to do what it always does, which is decide a waitress isn't worth fighting for and stay silent." Wren turned her father's watch on her wrist. "I'm betting she's wrong. I'm betting you came here this morning because you're done being the family that stays silent. I'm betting 50 years is long enough." Eleanor Vance looked at her for a long, cold, level moment. The moment Wren would later understand was Beat B, the doomed confrontation, the matriarch on her home ground even in a diner, deciding whether to hurt the girl or hear her. You don't know anything about my family, Eleanor said. You served my grandson soup. That doesn't make you. It doesn't make me anything, you're right. Wren stood up. She'd land the one dignified truth and let it sit. You couldn't push a wall, you could only show it the door. I'm not asking to be a Vance, Mrs. Vance. I wouldn't survive you people a week. I'm asking you to do for Lena now what nobody did for her then. That's all. The vote's tomorrow. Crane's counting on your silence. You know where to find me. She set a fresh coffee in front of the old woman, the good gesture, the one she gave everyone, even her enemies, even now. On the house. You look like you could use it. Whatever you decide. She went to wipe down the booths. And behind her, very quietly, after a long time, she heard the small sound of a ringed thumb starting to turn again. Around and around, a woman doing long division with 50 years of silence, and Wren did not look back, because some math a person has to do alone. The next part she could not do alone. The next part needed Elias, and Elias had decided he was a curse, and a man who has decided he is a curse does not answer his phone. So Wren did the only thing she knew how to do. She made soup. She went to the tower. The gold one, the one she could see from the diner window, and she walked into a lobby with a ceiling like a cathedral, and a floor like a frozen lake, her wet shoes loud on the cold, polished stone, carrying a soup container warm against her ribs in a paper bag, the smell of it rising sweet through the paper, in her diner jacket, with her father's watch on her wrist, and the security guard looked at her, the way the world had been looking at her since the website. And she said, I'm here for Elias Vance, and the guard said Mr. Vance isn't seeing anyone, and Wren said, tell him Pearl over-ordered. She had to say it twice. The guard, baffled, finally relayed it into his phone, the exact strange words, tell him Pearl over-ordered, and Wren watched his face change as the voice on the other end said something, and then she was riding up in an elevator with a view that made her stomach drop, to a floor with no sound in it at all, exactly as Elias had described. Very good acoustics and nothing to hear. And the doors opened and he was standing there, unshaven again, 2 days of it, the suit jacket gone, looking like a man halfway back to the doorway. You shouldn't be here, he said. The press is. If they see you here, it makes it worse. It proves there. Eat your soup, Wren said, and pushed past him into an office the size of her whole apartment, and set the container on a desk that had probably cost more than her father had, earned in his life, and turned around and put her hands on her hips. I'm not here as a doorway romance, Elias. I'm not here to be photographed. I'm here because you're about to do the thing you did when you were 16. You're about to let the silence stand. You're about to let Crane win and call it protecting me. And I came to tell you it won't protect me. It'll just mean she used your late mother to take your company. And you let her. And you'll spend the next 18 years pressing your knuckles to your chest about it. The same way you spent the last 18 about Lena. He started to say her name again. I'm not finished. She took a breath. Crane made a mistake. She put it in writing. She told a website that she's been managing a grieving CEO. She admitted, in print with a byline, that she's been deliberately exploiting your mother's death as a strategy to prove you're unfit. That's not gossip, Elias. That's a confession. The board doesn't care that you fed a waitress soup. But they will care, every single one of them, that their COO is the kind of person who'll use a man's late mother as a press tactic. Because if she'll do it to you, she'll do it to them, and people like that always think about themselves last and survive longest. You don't fight the website. You walk into that boardroom tomorrow, and you read them Crane's own quote, and you let them understand exactly what they'd be handing the company to. She stopped. Her heart was going. That's the company part. I can't do that part, that's yours. But there's another part, and it's the part you actually can't do. Because you've believed the wrong thing about yourself since you were 16, and a man can't argue himself out of a thing he learned that young. She crossed the room. She stood close. So I'm going to tell you the true thing, and you're going to let me, and you're not going to give me money or distance afterward to make it stop. Elias, you are not a curse. The people around you don't get punished for loving you. Your mother wasn't punished for loving you. She was punished by Eleanor for loving your father, and you've spent 18 years taking the blame for a verdict an old woman handed down. I'm not on a website because I loved you. I'm on a website because a woman named Vivian Crane is a coward who's afraid of a vote. Those are different things. You have to learn they're different things. Or you're going to spend the rest of your life in a doorway, and I am not going to bring you soup there, because I refuse to feed a man who'd rather be a tragedy than be loved. He stared at her. The office hummed with its expensive silence, and then Elias Vance, billionaire, did the thing he had never once done in 11 weeks in a doorway or 2 weeks in the worst booth. He stopped, holding the wound closed. His knuckles came away from his sternum, and his face came apart, not gracefully, the way a man cries who has not cried since his mother was buried, and Wren did the thing she had not let herself do at the door in the snow. She closed the last inch. She put her arms around a man worth $1 billion in an office the size of her apartment, and she held him up the way she'd held up a soup container against the cold, the way Pearl had held her, the way nobody had held her father in the parking lot. She said into his shoulder, "I've got you. For once in your life, somebody's got you, and she's not going anywhere, and she doesn't want your money. She wants you to win tomorrow, and then come back and learn to refill the coffee cup without scalding your thumb. That's the whole invoice. That's all it costs." "That's a terrible business model," he said, wrecked into her hair. "There he is," she said. "There's my almost." And she felt him laugh, broken and real, against her. And somewhere far below them, the city went about its morning, and a woman with squared papers prepared for a vote she did not know she had already lost, because she had never once in her practical life understood the one thing that had just happened 40 floors up. That a person had stopped. The boardroom Wren did not see. That was Elias's to walk into alone, and he did, the next morning, shaved and suited and steady, and Wren spent the hours of it at the diner, pretending to refill napkin dispensers that were already full, while Pearl pretended not to watch her, not cope, and Theo texted from school every 20 minutes any news, until Wren turned the phone face down on the counter and gave herself over to the buzzing H and the long arithmetic of waiting. But she heard about it, after in pieces, from Elias, from the news, from the single unbelievable thing that happened at the end that no one had planned. He had walked in and he had not raged, and he had not pleaded. He had set a printout on the long table, the website article, Crane's own quote highlighted in yellow, and he had read it aloud to the room in the worn, thin voice that turned out to carry better than any shout. And he had said, in essence, "This is the person you are being asked to hand the company to. A person who used my mother's death as a press strategy." He had not defended Wren. He had understood, finally, that defending Wren would prove Crane's frame. Instead, he had simply shown the room the maker of the weapon, and let them feel the cold of it, and let them imagine it pointed at them. And the room, which did not care about doorways or waitresses or soup, had cared very much about that, because a board is a collection of people, each privately certain they are next, and Crane had just shown them all exactly what she'd do to a grieving man. The vote did not even get called. Crane read the room. She was, as Elias had always said, never wrong about the worst version of a thing, and the worst version of this was true. And she squared her papers one last time, and she stood, and she said something about pursuing other opportunities. And she left with her dignity intact, and her power gone, which was, Wren thought when she heard it, exactly the ending the woman had once offered her. One with dignity intact and nothing else. The world has a sense of humor, even if its 2 cents come with a hook. And then the thing no one had planned. As Crane reached the boardroom door, a voice from the head of the table, where she had not sat in 5 years, said, "Sit down, Vivian. I haven't finished." And the room turned, and Eleanor Vance was standing. The matriarch, the foundation chair, the keeper of who the Vances were, who had let herself in on the strength of a name that still opened every door in the building. She did not look at Crane. She looked at the long table of frightened, powerful people, and she said, in a voice 50 years overdue, "I want to say something about my daughter, about Lena. There has been a photograph circulating of my daughter in an apron with a caption that calls her the waitress this family never accepted. The caption is accurate. We did not accept her. I did not accept her. She married a good man who cooked for his living, and I decided that made her less. And I was wrong, and she was gone before I found the courage to tell her so. And I have come here this morning, finally, to tell all of you instead, since I cannot tell her, my daughter was the best of us. She married for love and raised a son alone. In the warmth, my coldness denied them both, and the only thing wrong with the woman in that apron was the family that was too small to deserve her." She turned, then, to Elias, and her voice did the smallest thing, the thing Wren had heard it do, over a cup of coffee at dawn, the hairline crack in 50 years of stone. "And I owe her son an apology I will spend the rest of my life paying. Starting with this," and she set on the table a single sheet of paper. A letter Wren would learn, Lena's last letter to her mother, unanswered for years, that Eleanor had kept in a desk and, finally, that dawn in the diner, decided to answer in the only currency she had left. The public witnessed irreversible truth. She stepped down as chair of the foundation that afternoon and named her successor, and the successor's first act, at Eleanor's instruction, was to fund a culinary scholarship in Lena Vance's name for the children of restaurant workers. For the children, the announcement said, of the people who feed us, whom we are too often too small to see. It cost her. That was the thing Wren understood, hearing it. Eleanor Vance had surrendered the one thing she had spent her whole life accumulating, which was the right to decide who counted, and she had surrendered it in public, on the record, in front of every person whose respect she had ever cultivated, and she had done it for a daughter who could no longer hear it. That was the apology with a cost. That was beat C, though Wren had no name for it. That was a wall deciding to become a door. Crane left. The scholarship was announced, and 40 floors down, a man who was no longer a curse walked out of his own building into a grey December afternoon, and got into a black car the length of a small boat and told the driver, to the driver's lasting confusion, to take him to the worst diner in the city. He came in at the usual hour, into the cold and the warm yellow light, and the bell rang, and Wren looked up from the counter with her heart in her throat, and he was clean-shaven and steady, and he was carrying, of all things, a paper bag, and he crossed the worn linoleum to the counter and set the bag down in front of her, and inside it was a soup container, warm. "I made it myself," he said. "It's terrible," I scalded my thumb, Pearl overordered, and Wren Delaney, who had spent 2 winters believing her whole purpose was to give and never receive, who had stood frozen on a sidewalk. The night she learned the man in the doorway had a name, picked up the container a billionaire had filled with terrible soup and held it against her ribs the way she'd carried 100 others across her. Anstenstreffen. Cold Street, except this one was coming the other way. This one was for her, and she let it be for her. And that, finally, was the floor not opening. That was the same thing coming around, the same time, keeping its promise, because she had stopped, even for her own heart, especially for her own heart, at last. She never over-orders, Wren said, and her voice did the complicated thing, and Elias came around the counter, which customers were not allowed to do, and Pearl said, "Honey, that's employees only," without a shred of conviction, and he took the soup out of Wren's hands and set it down, and took her face in both his hands. His palms rough and warm against her cold cheeks, the way he had in the snow, and this time neither of them turned away. The kiss tasted like coffee and winter, and faintly, terribly, of soup. Old Marcus applauded from his stool. Theo, who had skipped a study session and would later claim he'd had a feeling, whooped from booth 4. Pearl wiped her eyes with a ketchup-stained rag and said to no one, dry to the last, 31 years I waited for somebody to clean that grease trap, and instead I get a wedding. Honey, I'll take it. They did not, in fact, get a wedding for some time, because Wren refused to be rushed, and Elias had a company to actually run now, and a grandmother to slowly, carefully, learn to forgive, which he did, the two of them meeting for coffee at the Lantern on the first Sunday of every month. The matriarch and the heir in the worst booth, where Eleanor learned, late but truly, to ask the waitresses their names. And Elias never fixed the buzzing H, because Wren forbade it, and it buzzed on through the seasons, the sound of the place that had fed them both. And when people asked Elias Vance, billionaire, why, on earth he spent his Sunday mornings in a diner he could have bought 100 times over, he would say the measure of a man is who he is to the people who can't do anything for him. And they would assume it was a slogan, and only Wren would know it was his mother, kept alive at last in the warm yellow light, in the place where her son had finally learned to stop. The spring after the worst winter, on a cold snap night that came down the avenue like a tide pulling back, Wren walked home from her shift. She still worked some shifts. She would always work some shifts. You do not stop being a person who stops just because you no longer have to. And at the end of the block, in the recessed doorway of the watch repair shop that Elias had quietly bought and reopened, and given, to run, to the next person they'd found folded against the cold there, because a doorway that had once sheltered Elias would not be left to swallow anyone else. There was a light on, and warmth coming out, and a sign in the window that Wren had written herself and Elias had made into proper brass. It said, "We fix what keeps time. All welcome. Soup inside." And every single night on her way home, Wren Delaney still walked past that doorway. And every single night, the way she had her whole life, the way she always would, she stopped. Not because anyone needed her to anymore, but because stopping was simply who she was, the one thing the footage in the parking lot could never have shown, the small, stubborn miracle of her, that in a city of people learning to walk past, there had always been, and would always be, a girl who crossed the street with something warm held against her ribs, afraid it would go cold before it reached the person who needed it. She went inside. The bell rang. Someone she loved looked up, and the warm yellow light closed around her like a promise the world, this time, had finally decided to keep.